Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we return to the spring of the year 1453, to the final days before one of the most important events in world history, the fall of Constantinople. But this is not only the story of a battle, it is also the story of a city waiting, a city that had stood for more than 1,000 years, a city where candles still burned in quiet homes, where merchants still opened their shops in the morning, where priests still whispered prayers beneath ancient stone ceilings, even as an empire stood at its final edge. Outside the walls, the Ottoman army waited. Inside, the people of Constantinople continued living through what they did not yet know would be their final peaceful nights. Tonight, we will slowly explore those final days. We will walk through the streets of the city, stand on the great walls beside the defenders, and look across the dark fields where Sultan Mehmed II prepared for the final assault. We will see how emperors, soldiers, priests, and ordinary families faced the quiet approach of history. And we will begin where every great ending begins, with silence. By the year 1453, Constantinople was no longer the powerful centre it had once been. For centuries, it had been the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, known to many simply as the continuation of Rome itself. Its position between Europe and Asia made it one of the most valuable cities in the world. Ships from distant ports entered its harbours. Merchants crossed its markets, speaking many languages. Its churches held centuries of memory. And above all, the great dome of Hagia Sophia watched over the city like a second sky. But time had changed everything. The empire had grown smaller. Its lands had been lost piece by piece over generations. The once vast Byzantine world had been reduced until little remained beyond the city itself. What had once been an empire had become a capital surrounded by memories. Its population had fallen. Many neighbourhoods were quieter than they had been in earlier centuries. Some districts that had once been full of life now stood half empty, their old buildings carrying more silence than voices. Still, Constantinople remained extraordinary. Its walls alone were enough to remind the world of its strength. Especially on the western side of the city stood the famous Theodosian walls, one of the greatest defensive systems ever built in the medieval world. 3 layers of defense, a deep outer ditch, massive stone walls, high towers placed carefully along the line of defense. For hundreds of years, these walls had protected the city from invasion. Many rulers had come here believing they would succeed. Most had failed. The walls had outlived kings, armies, and entire dynasties. But now, a new enemy stood before them. And this enemy was different. Outside the city was Sultan Mehmed II, only 21 years old, young enough that many underestimated him. But behind that youth was a ruler of unusual discipline and patience. He was not reckless. He was not rushing toward glory. He was preparing for something he believed was inevitable. For Mehmed, the conquest of Constantinople was not simply a military campaign. it was the completion of something much larger. The city stood between his empire's lands in Europe and Asia. As long as Constantinople remained independent, it remained a symbol of division. But beyond politics, it was also a matter of history. To conquer Constantinople was to place his name beside the great rulers of the past. It meant ending one empire and beginning another. He understood this very clearly. And so, long before the siege itself began, he prepared. One of his first major steps was the construction of Rumeli Fortress on the Bosporus. This massive stone fortress stood on the European side of the strait and gave the Ottomans greater control over naval movement. It was not simply a defensive structure, it was a message, a sign that the young Sultan was serious, a sign that Constantinople would no longer be allowed to rely on easy support from the sea. At the same time, Mehmed strengthened his navy and expanded his army. But perhaps the most important part of his preparation came from something much louder: cannons. Enormous bombard cannons designed to do what older armies could not: break the ancient walls of Constantinople. A Hungarian engineer named Urban helped create these massive weapons. Some of them were so large they required enormous effort just to move. When fired, the sound could be heard from great distances. They were not elegant weapons. They were slow, heavy, and difficult to manage. But they represented something new. The old age of stone walls and medieval defense was meeting the new age of gunpowder, and history was about to choose between them. On April 6, 1453, the siege officially began. The Ottoman army surrounded Constantinople by land. From the shores of the Marmara Sea to the northern edges near the Golden Horn, thousands of soldiers spread across the landscape. Janissaries, Sipahi cavalry, Akinci raiders, artillery units, engineers, workers, naval forces. It was not only an army, it was a moving city of war. Tents stretched across the land like a second horizon. Supply wagons moved constantly. Horses, tools, ropes, siege equipment, food stores, and endless preparations filled the camp. Every day had structure. Every movement had purpose. And from inside Constantinople, the people could see it all. During the day, the sound of cannon fire became part of life. Each blast echoed through the streets. Walls trembled. Dust fell from old stone ceilings. Children stopped speaking when the explosions came. People looked at one another silently, already understanding what words could not fix. The great walls were still standing, but they were being tested in ways they had never been tested before. At night, the city became quieter, and somehow the silence felt heavier. From the walls, Byzantine soldiers could look across the dark land and see the fires of the Ottoman camp. Hundreds of small flames stretching into the distance, like stars that had fallen to the earth. Some nights, the wind carried distant sounds, the movement of horses, metal striking metal, low voices, commands spoken in the dark. Other nights, there was almost nothing, only stillness. And sometimes that silence felt worse than noise. Inside the city, daily life continued, but more slowly. Markets still opened, bread was still baked, water was still carried through the streets, but everything felt different. People moved with the quiet awareness that the future had become uncertain. The churches were full, especially Hagia Sophia. There, under candlelight and beneath the great dome, people gathered to pray. Some prayed for victory, some prayed for rescue, some simply prayed for peace. Priests led ceremonies that felt heavier than usual. Voices echoed through the stone halls. Candles flickered against old walls. And many people, without saying it aloud, wondered if they were witnessing the final days of the city they had always known. There was still hope. Some believed help would come from the West, from Venice, from Genoa, from the Pope. Perhaps ships would arrive. Perhaps reinforcements would break the siege. Perhaps history would turn one final time. But day after day, that hope grew smaller. The great rescue never truly came. And slowly, everyone understood the truth. Constantinople was alone. Its emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, knew this better than anyone. He was not ruling a great empire anymore. He was defending its final walls. His forces were small, perhaps 7,000 or 8,000 defenders in total. Among them were Byzantine soldiers, Genoese mercenaries, and volunteers. They were facing an Ottoman force many times larger. The numbers were impossible. But by now, numbers no longer mattered. This had become something else, something larger than victory. It had become a question of legacy. Some advised the emperor to leave the city, to escape while there was still time. He refused. He chose to stay. Because some rulers are remembered for surviving. Others are remembered for standing where history ends. Each day, Constantine walked the walls. He spoke with soldiers. He inspected towers. He stood beside men who already knew they might not live to see the next sunrise. He understood the truth. This was not simply a defense. It was the final stand of Constantinople. And outside the walls, Sultan Mehmed was preparing for the same moment. Each night, inside his great war tent, he met with his commanders. Maps were spread across large wooden tables. Reports were read. Weak points in the walls were discussed. The navy's position was reviewed. Every tower, every gate, every weakness mattered. He was young, but he was patient. He did not rush, because he understood that this victory would not simply be remembered as a conquest. It would be remembered as the end of an age. If Constantinople fell, the world would change. And now, that moment was drawing closer. Slowly, quietly. Only a few nights remained. As the final days of May arrived, the atmosphere around Constantinople changed. The long siege had already lasted for weeks. The walls had been struck again and again by Ottoman cannons. The defenders were exhausted. The people inside the city had grown used to the sound of distant explosions, the trembling of stone walls, and the quiet fear that followed every night. But now something felt different. Both sides understood that the end was near. This would not be another ordinary attack. This would be the final assault. By the evening of May 28th, 1453, Constantinople stood in a strange silence. The city was still alive. People still walked through its narrow streets. Candles still burned behind wooden windows. Shops were closed, but homes were awake. No one truly slept. The air itself seemed heavy, as if the city were holding its breath. Along the Theodosian walls, Byzantine soldiers stood at their positions. Some had been fighting for weeks with little rest. Their armor was worn. Their faces showed exhaustion more than fear. They knew the walls had been weakened. They knew the Ottoman army would come again at dawn. And they knew that this next attack might be the last. Emperor Constantine XI spent much of that day moving between the defences. He visited the walls. He spoke to commanders. He stood beside soldiers who would soon be asked to defend the final hours of an empire. There was no false hope now, no promises of rescue, no illusion that a great fleet from the west would suddenly appear. The emperor understood the truth clearly. Constantinople would survive only if the men on those walls could hold it with their own hands. And even that seemed unlikely. Still, he did not leave. He did not speak of surrender. He remained calm. Those who saw him later wrote that he carried himself not like a desperate ruler, but like a man who had already accepted his fate. That evening, one final religious ceremony was held inside Hagia Sophia. It would become one of the most remembered moments of the entire siege. For centuries, Hagia Sophia had stood as the spiritual heart of the Byzantine world. Its massive dome had watched coronations, victories, funerals, and prayers through generations of emperors. Now, under candlelight, it would witness one final gathering. People came from every part of the city. Nobles, soldiers, priests, mothers holding children, old men who had seen the city in better years. Even those who had spent years divided by politics or religion stood together that night, because, in the face of the end, old arguments seemed smaller. Inside the great church, candles flickered against marble walls. Voices echoed softly beneath the enormous dome. Prayers were spoken slowly. Some people cried quietly. Some simply stood in silence. Many believed they were attending the final prayer of Constantinople. Emperor Constantine himself was there. He prayed beside his people. not as a distant ruler, but as a man standing among them. Some accounts say he asked forgiveness from those around him. Some say he prayed for strength. Others say he said very little at all. But everyone understood the meaning of that night. It was not simply a ceremony, it was farewell. Outside the church, the city remained strangely calm. The streets were darker than usual. Many families stayed inside their homes, speaking quietly. Some prepared simple meals. Some sat in silence. Some listened to the distant sounds coming from beyond the walls. Parents tried to keep children calm. Old neighbors visited one another. People did ordinary things because ordinary things were all they had left. Sometimes history arrives loudly. Sometimes it arrives in silence, while someone is lighting a candle or closing a window for the night. Beyond the walls, the Ottoman camp was also preparing. But there, the silence felt different. It was not fear, it was discipline. Thousands of soldiers were ready. The final orders had already been given. The siege towers were prepared. The artillery was in position. The attack would begin before sunrise. Across the camp, fires burned low in the darkness. Some soldiers sat quietly beside them. Some prayed. Some sharpened blades or checked armor straps one final time. Others simply looked toward the city walls, waiting. For many of them, tomorrow would be the most important day of their lives. For some, it would be the last. At the center of the camp stood the great war tent of Sultan Mehmed II. Inside, the young sultan met with his commanders one final time. Maps were spread across wooden tables. Reports from scouts were read. The weakest sections of the walls were discussed again. Every unit had its place. Every movement had been planned. The first waves of attack, the artillery bombardment, the janissaries, the naval pressure from the Golden Horn. Nothing was left to chance. Mehmed listened carefully. He asked questions. He adjusted details. He was only 21 years old, but there was no uncertainty in him now. He had prepared for this moment for years. He understood what victory would mean, not only for the Ottoman Empire, but for history itself. When the meeting ended, the camp grew quieter. The soldiers rested where they could. The commanders checked positions one final time. The night deepened, and over the city of Constantinople, the stars remained cold and distant. From the walls, Byzantine guards could still see the fires of the Ottoman camp. From the camp, Ottoman soldiers could still see the shadow of the ancient city rising in the darkness. Between them stood only stone, silence, and a few remaining hours. Before dawn, everything would change. But for now, the city still stood. The bells were silent. The candles still burned. And Constantinople waited for morning. As night deepened over Constantinople, the city became quieter than it had been in many weeks. The noise of the cannons had stopped for the evening. The markets were empty. The streets, usually filled with merchants, priests, and workers, were now heavy with silence. People moved slowly, speaking in lower voices than usual, as if loud words themselves might disturb the fragile peace of the final night. Everyone understood that morning would bring something terrible. No one needed to say it. It was already written in the faces of the people, in the tired eyes of the soldiers, and in the long shadows cast by candlelight through narrow stone streets. Across the city, many people made their way toward one place, Hagia Sophia. For nearly 900 years, it had stood at the center of Byzantine life. It was more than a church. It was the heart of the empire. Emperors had been crowned beneath its dome. Victories had been celebrated there. Funerals had been mourned there. Generations of prayers had risen beneath its vast ceiling. Its walls had seen the rise and fall of dynasties. Its silence had outlived kings. And now, on the night before the final assault, it would witness one last gathering. The great bronze doors remained open late into the evening. People entered slowly. Some came alone. Some came with family. Some arrived carrying children who were too young to understand what was happening. Soldiers came, still wearing parts of their armor. Old men walked carefully with the help of canes. Women covered their faces and whispered prayers before stepping inside. There were nobles and servants, rich and poor, priests and merchants. People who had spent years divided by politics, by religion, or by personal grievance. But that night, those divisions felt smaller. The city itself was larger than all of them, and everyone understood that they might be standing together for the final time. Inside Hagia Sophia, the air felt cool and still. Hundreds of candles burned softly, their light moving across marble floors and tall stone columns. The great dome above seemed almost endless in the darkness, floating like a second night sky above the people below. Gold mosaics reflected small pieces of candlelight. The sound of footsteps echoed gently. Then came the prayers, slowly, softly, without performance, without pride. Priests stood before the gathered crowd and began the final liturgy. Ancient words filled the church, words that had been spoken there for centuries, words that had survived wars, plagues, invasions, and emperors. Now, those same words sounded different, heavier, final. Some people knelt. Some stood with closed eyes. Some cried quietly without trying to hide it. Others simply stared upward, as if looking for answers in the darkness above the dome. There was fear in that church, but there was also peace. Because when people know they are standing at the edge of history, sometimes silence becomes more honest than speech. Emperor Constantine XI entered not as a distant ruler, but as a man among his people. There were no grand royal ceremonies left, no safe distance between emperor and citizen. Only the shared understanding that tomorrow all of them would face the same dawn. He stood among soldiers, priests, and ordinary families, and for a moment the empire felt less like a throne and more like a single room filled with people refusing to disappear quietly. Some later accounts say that Constantine asked forgiveness from those around him, that he spoke with humility, that he prayed not for victory but for strength. Whether every detail is true, no one can know with certainty, but the meaning remains clear. He was no longer only an emperor, he was a man preparing to die with his city. Outside Hagia Sophia, the night continued. The wind moved softly through empty streets. Some homes still showed candlelight behind wooden shutters. In small kitchens, simple meals were shared. Bread, olives, water. Nothing grand, just the ordinary rituals of people trying to remain human while history waited outside their doors. Parents tried to keep children calm. Some told stories. Some said prayers at home. Some simply sat beside sleeping sons and daughters, watching them breathe, wondering what morning would bring. For many people, the final night of Constantinople was not spent in heroism. It was spent in waiting, in listening, in hoping for a miracle that was becoming harder to believe. Back inside Hagia Sophia, the final prayers continued late into the night. Voices rose and fell beneath the dome like waves. The church had seen centuries of empire. Tonight, it was watching the end of one. No one there could know exactly what the next day would look like, but everyone understood that after sunrise, nothing would remain the same. The city they had known all their lives was standing on the edge of disappearance. And still the candles burned. Still the prayers continued. Still Hagia Sophia stood in silence, holding the final night of Byzantium within its walls. Far beyond the church, outside the city, the Ottoman camp waited in darkness. The soldiers there were preparing for battle. Inside Constantinople, the people were preparing for farewell. And between those two worlds stood only the walls, the night, and the final hours before dawn. While the people of Constantinople gathered in churches and quiet homes, the world outside the walls looked very different. Beyond the great stone defences of the city, the Ottoman camp stretched across the dark land like another city of its own. It was vast. From the shores of the Marmara Sea to the hills near the Golden Horn, thousands of tents covered the earth. Fires burned between them. Horses moved in the shadows. Weapons rested beside sleeping soldiers. And, above everything, the walls of Constantinople stood in the distance, silent and dark against the night sky. The siege had lasted for weeks. By now, the camp had become a world with its own rhythm. There were places for soldiers, for commanders, for engineers, for horses, for food stores, and for the great cannons that had shaken the city day after day. Every road inside the camp had a purpose. Every tent belonged to a unit. Every movement followed order. This was not chaos, it was discipline. As evening turned into night, large cooking fires still burned in many places. Soldiers sat beside them in small groups, eating simple meals before the final assault. Bread, soup, cooked meat, water. Nothing luxurious, only enough to prepare the body for what tomorrow would demand. Some men spoke quietly with friends they had marched beside for years. Others sat in silence, staring into the fire. Many were thinking the same thing. Tomorrow could be victory. Tomorrow could also be death. For younger soldiers, this would be the greatest battle of their lives. For older veterans, it was another night before war. But even they understood that this siege was different. Constantinople was not an ordinary city. Its name carried weight. Its walls had challenged rulers for centuries. To stand here, so close to its fall, meant standing near history itself. In another part of the camp, blacksmiths were still working. The sound of metal against metal rang softly through the night. Swords were sharpened, armor straps were repaired, broken shields were checked again. There would be no time for mistakes at dawn. Nearby, engineers moved carefully around the great siege equipment. Wooden towers, scaling ladders, heavy tools for breaking defenses. Everything had to be ready. The massive cannons stood like sleeping giants in the darkness. During the day, they had spoken with thunder. Now they were silent. Their bronze bodies still warm from hours of firing. Men checked wheels, ropes, and powder supplies for the morning. These cannons were more than weapons. They were symbols, proof that old walls could no longer trust old strength alone. Not far from them, groups of janissaries prepared quietly. Unlike many other soldiers, they did not gather with loud conversation. Their discipline was famous throughout the empire. They were trained for moments like this, the final assault, the breaking point. Many checked their weapons one last time. Others prayed. Some simply sat still, conserving both strength and thought. They knew they would be called when the moment was most critical. And when that moment came, hesitation could not exist. Across the camp, religion also shaped the night. Some soldiers performed evening prayers. Some read quietly from the Quran. Others asked for courage, for protection, or for the chance to survive what was coming. For many, this was not only a military campaign, it was something spiritual. A moment they believed had meaning beyond victory itself. Faith moved through the camp as naturally as the wind. Not loudly, but everywhere. At the center of it all stood the great command tent of Sultan Mehmed II. Larger than the others, guarded carefully and lit late into the night. Inside, the final decisions were being made. Commanders entered and left. Messengers carried reports. Scouts returned with information from the walls. Nothing was ignored. Mehmed wanted certainty. He understood that victory was closest in the final hours, but also most fragile there. A single mistake could delay everything, and delay was dangerous, because time favored the defenders. The longer the city stood, the greater the chance that outside help might arrive. He would not allow that. Inside the tent, maps covered large wooden tables. The walls of Constantinople were marked carefully. The weakest sections, the repaired breaches, the defensive towers, the movement of the Byzantine guards, the position of ships in the Golden Horn. Every detail mattered. The first wave of attack would weaken the defenders. The second would increase pressure. And then, when the moment was right, the janissaries would be sent forward. This was not a wild charge, it was a machine built from patience, and Mehmed was controlling every part of it. Though he was only 21, he did not appear uncertain. He had prepared for this siege for years. He had studied the city. He had built fortresses. He had strengthened the navy. He had invested everything into this moment. For him, Constantinople was not simply a target. It was the center of a future empire. When the meetings paused, he sometimes stepped outside. From there, he could look toward the city. In the darkness, Constantinople appeared almost unreal. Its towers and walls rose like shadows from another age. The lights inside were few. The city looked tired, ancient, waiting. Some said Mehmed would stand there silently for long moments, looking at the walls without speaking. Perhaps he was thinking of strategy, perhaps of history, perhaps of the strange truth that tomorrow, if everything succeeded, he would walk inside that city not as a visitor, but as its conqueror. Around midnight, the camp grew quieter. Some soldiers finally rested. Others remained awake. Nobles, commanders, engineers, guards. Everyone understood that sleep would not come easily. Too much depended on the morning. From the walls of Constantinople, Byzantine soldiers watched the fires below. From the Ottoman camp, soldiers watched the dark outline of the city above. Neither side could fully rest. Both knew what dawn would bring. Between them stood only the night. And with every passing hour, that night became shorter. While the people of Constantinople watched the great cannons and the endless Ottoman camp beyond the land walls, another danger was beginning far from the main battlefield. At first, it did not seem like the greatest threat. The Golden Horn, the great natural harbour of the city, had always been one of Constantinople's strongest protections. Its calm waters guarded the northern side of the city, and for centuries it had served as both shield and lifeline. Most importantly, the entrance to the harbour was protected by something the defenders trusted deeply: the Great Iron Chain. This enormous chain stretched across the mouth of the Golden Horn, blocking enemy ships from entering. It had stopped fleets before. It was heavy, strong, and guarded carefully. As long as that chain remained in place, the Byzantines believed the harbour was safe. And if the harbour was safe, one side of the city could still breathe. Sultan Mehmed understood this perfectly. His army surrounded Constantinople by land, and his cannons were slowly testing the ancient walls. But without full control of the Golden Horn, the city still had room to resist. Byzantine and Genoese ships could still move inside the harbour. supplies could still arrive. The northern sea walls remained less threatened than the western land walls. If Constantinople was to fall, the Golden Horn had to be turned from a shield into a weakness. Breaking the chain directly was difficult, too visible, too dangerous, too expected. So Mehmed chose something else, something that sounded impossible. Instead of forcing his ships through the water, he would move them across the land. Warships were not made for hills. They were massive wooden vessels built for the sea, heavy with structure and impossible by ordinary thinking to drag over forests and steep ground. Many would have laughed at the idea. But Mehmed was not interested in what seemed reasonable. He was interested in what would work. Orders were given. North of Galata, workers, engineers and soldiers began preparing a secret path. Trees were cut, wooden rollers were placed across the earth, tracks were built carefully over the hills. Grease and animal fat were spread to reduce friction. Everything was done with speed and discipline. At night, while much of Constantinople slept behind its walls, the work began. Oxen pulled, soldiers pushed, ropes tightened, men shouted commands into the darkness, and slowly, almost unbelievably, the ships began to move. Large Ottoman vessels were dragged uphill across the land above Galata, toward the waters of the Golden Horn. Under moonlight, it must have looked unreal. Ships moving where ships should never be. Wood grinding against wood. Men straining in silence. A fleet crossing the hills like a ghost army. By morning, the impossible had become reality. Ottoman ships were inside the Golden Horn, behind the chain, behind the trusted line of defence. Inside Constantinople, shock spread quickly. From the walls, defenders looked toward the harbour and saw enemy sails where no enemy ships should have been. Disbelief turned to fear. The chain had not been broken. It had been made useless. And sometimes that is far worse. Because walls can defend against force, but they struggle against imagination. Now the northern side of the city was threatened in a new way. The sea walls along the Golden Horn were weaker than the great Theodosian walls. Troops had to be moved. Attention had to be divided. Every soldier sent north meant fewer men protecting the land walls. Every new threat meant less sleep, less certainty, less hope. Mehmed had done more than move ships. He had changed the psychology of the siege. He had shown the city that old defences were no longer enough, that this would not be another ordinary siege, that this enemy was willing to rewrite the rules of war itself. The people inside Constantinople felt it. The soldiers on the walls felt it. Even Emperor Constantine understood what it meant. The city was still standing, but something invisible had shifted. Confidence, belief. And in long sieges, belief can be stronger than stone. Years later, people would still speak of it like legend. The Ships Over Land. A story so dramatic it sounded like myth. But on those dark hills above the Golden Horn, it was very real. And from that moment forward, everyone understood the same truth. This siege would not end like the others. The city was no longer waiting for possibility. It was waiting for the final assault. As midnight passed and the Ottoman camp grew quieter, the largest tent in the camp remained awake. At its center sat Sultan Mehmed II. Around him stood maps, candles, military reports, and the men who would help decide the final hours of the siege. Outside, thousands of soldiers waited for dawn. Inside, the future of Constantinople was being discussed in silence and careful words. The command tent was not a place of comfort. It was a place of decisions. Large wooden tables were covered with maps of the city walls. The Theodosian defences were marked in detail. Every tower, every damaged section, every repaired breach, every gate. The Golden Horn, the harbour, the sea walls. Nothing was too small to matter. Weeks of siege had turned every stone of Constantinople into military knowledge. Mehmed stood over the maps with the calm focus of someone who had already imagined this moment many times. He had studied this city long before he had come to surround it. He knew its strength, but he also knew its weakness. The walls were still standing, but they were tired. The defenders were still resisting, but they were exhausted. The city had survived on hope for weeks, and hope was becoming thinner with every sunrise. Around him were some of the most important men in the Ottoman Empire: Zaganos Pasha, Shandali Halil Pasha, other generals, commanders, and military advisors. Each brought experience, each offered opinions, and not all of them agreed. Some believed the siege had already gone on too long. Some feared unnecessary losses. Some still worried that European support might arrive by sea. There were voices that suggested caution, even withdrawal. But Mehmed did not come to withdraw. For him, failure was not an option. He had committed too much. Not only soldiers and resources, but reputation, authority, future power. To leave now would not simply be a military defeat, it would be a wound to the empire itself. And so he listened, but his decision was already clear. The final assault would happen, before dawn, with full force. Reports were read aloud. Scouts had observed movement on the walls. Repairs had been made to the damaged sections, but not enough. The defenders were stretched thin. The weakest points remained near the land walls, especially around the gate of St. Romanus. That would be one of the main targets. The artillery would begin first. The great cannons would fire again before sunrise, breaking what remained of the weakened stone. After that, the first wave would advance. These were lighter troops, sent to exhaust the defenders and test their response. Not the final blow, but necessary. Then a second wave would follow. More pressure, more confusion, more fatigue on the walls. And when the defenders were fully committed, the Janissaries would move. This was the heart of the plan. Not speed, not chaos, pressure, layer after layer until resistance broke. Mehmed understood that cities did not always fall from one great strike. Sometimes they fell from exhaustion, from the moment when tired hands could no longer hold a sword, from the second when one gate was left unguarded, from the silence after too many nights without sleep. This was the moment he had been building toward. At one point, the tent became quiet. The commanders had spoken. The maps had been studied. The strategy was set. Only the waiting remained. Some accounts describe Mehmed in these final hours as calm, almost unusually calm for a ruler on the edge of such a decisive battle. He was young, but there was no sign of hesitation. He believed this city was meant to be taken, and he believed he was the one meant to take it. That belief gave him a kind of stillness, not arrogance, certainty. He stepped outside the tent for a moment. The night air was colder now. The fires across the camp burned lower. In the distance, Constantinople stood beneath the dark sky. Its towers were quiet. Its walls still held, but not for much longer. Somewhere inside that city, Emperor Constantine XI was also awake. Two rulers, two men, separated by stone walls and history, both knowing that by the next sunrise, one world would end and another would begin. Mehmed looked toward the city for a long time. He had dreamed of this moment since childhood, not only as a military victory, but as a turning point. If Constantinople fell, the Ottoman Empire would no longer be a rising state. It would become the center of a new age. Trade routes would shift. Power would move. History itself would change direction. He understood the weight of that. And perhaps that was why he stood so quietly. Because some victories are too large for celebration before they happen. When he returned inside, the final orders were given. Messengers left quickly. Commanders returned to their units. The attack would begin before dawn. No delay. No hesitation. The men outside would sleep little. The men on the walls would sleep less. And above them all, the stars remained distant and cold. The city waited. The army waited. and in the silence between midnight and morning, history waited too. The hours before dawn are often the quietest. Even during war, there is a strange stillness in those final moments before morning. On the last night of Constantinople, that silence felt heavier than ever. The city did not sleep, not really. Some people lay awake in dark rooms, listening to distant sounds from beyond the walls. Some sat beside candles that had burned low through the night. Some prayed. Some simply waited. There are moments in history when people stop asking what will happen and begin asking only when. This was one of those moments. Along the Theodosian walls, the defenders remained at their posts. The great stone defences that had protected Constantinople for centuries stood beneath the fading stars, scarred by weeks of bombardment. Broken sections had been repaired as quickly as possible. Wooden barriers stood behind damaged gates. Loose stone and earth had been packed into weak points. Everything that could be done had been done. Now only men remained. The soldiers on the walls were exhausted. Many had slept little for days. They had listened to cannon fire every morning. They had watched friends die beside them. They had carried stones, repaired breaches, and stood guard through endless nights. Armour had become part of their bodies. Fatigue had become part of their thoughts. And yet they stayed. Some stood silently, looking across the dark land toward the Ottoman camp. Others checked bows, swords, and shields for the 100th time. Some spoke quietly with the men beside them. Not about victory, not even about survival, but about simple things: family, home, memories. The kind of conversations people have when they know words may soon run out. The wind moved softly across the walls. It carried the smell of earth, smoke, and distant fire. Far below, the fields outside the city were dark, except for the scattered lights of the Ottoman camp. Fewer fires burned now. The enemy was preparing. That silence was its own warning. Emperor Constantine XI was still awake. He had spent much of the night moving between the walls and the churches, between prayer and duty. There was no palace comfort left for him now, only responsibility. He visited the soldiers one final time. He spoke to commanders. He offered encouragement where he could. But more than that, he offered presence. Sometimes a ruler cannot promise victory. Sometimes all he can do is remain beside his people. And that matters. Those who saw him that night described a man who looked calm, though everyone understood what calm meant now. He had accepted the possibility of death. He would not leave. He would not negotiate surrender. He would remain where the empire ended. There is a certain kind of peace that comes when all other choices disappear. Perhaps he had found that peace. Perhaps he was simply too tired for fear. No one can know. But history remembers that he stayed. Inside the city, church bells no longer rang loudly. The great prayers of the night had passed. Now the silence belonged to private thoughts. In homes across Constantinople, families waited for morning. Some parents watched sleeping children. Some couples sat together without speaking. Some elderly men stared at walls they had known for decades, wondering if those walls would still stand by sunrise. There were no speeches, no grand final words, only ordinary people living through extraordinary hours. And perhaps that is what history often forgets. Not only kings and battles, but the woman closing a window against the cold, the child sleeping through the final night of an empire, the old man listening for footsteps in the street. History moves through ordinary rooms before it enters books. Outside the city, the Ottoman army was also awake. The first movements had already begun. Units were taking their positions in darkness. Commands were spoken quietly. No drums yet, no horns, only preparation. The great cannons stood ready. The siege towers waited. The janissaries prepared in silence. The first assault waves were already moving toward the places they would wait for the signal. Both sides understood the same truth. When the sun rose, there would be no return. From one of the towers, a Byzantine guard looked toward the horizon. The sky was changing. Not bright yet, but no longer fully night. That pale line at the edge of the world meant time was almost gone. Morning was coming, and with it, the final attack. Somewhere beyond the darkness, Mehmed II was awake. Somewhere on these walls, Constantine XI was waiting. Two young rulers, two empires, one city between them. The stones beneath their feet had seen centuries of history. Now they were about to witness its turning point. The first birds had not yet begun to sing. The bells were silent. The streets were still. The walls stood, and Constantinople waited for dawn. Just before dawn, on May 29th, 1453, the silence finally ended. For weeks, Constantinople had lived in tension. The city had listened to cannons, watched the walls shake, and waited through long nights filled with uncertainty. But now, waiting was over. The final assault had begun. At first, it was sound that arrived before anything else. The deep thunder of Ottoman cannons broke the darkness. The ground trembled. Stone dust fell from ancient walls. Men on the defences tightened their grip on shields and swords. Across the city, families who had barely slept sat upright in silence, already knowing what that sound meant. This was not another test. This was the attack. Outside the walls, the Ottoman army moved forward in waves. The plan had been prepared carefully. Nothing was rushed. The first assault came from lighter troops, irregular forces and supporting units sent forward to pressure the defences, tire the defenders, and force them to spend strength before the main attack. They moved through the darkness, carrying ladders, ropes and shields. Arrows began to rise into the sky. Torches flickered. Commands were shouted. The walls answered with arrows, stones, and desperate resistance. Byzantine defenders fought from above, pushing ladders away, throwing down rocks, firing arrows into the mass below. The noise became constant. Metal striking stone, men shouting, the crash of bodies against walls. For the defenders, there was no room for panic, only action. Every second mattered. Every broken ladder, every gate that held, every soldier still standing. The Theodosian walls had survived centuries because they turned chaos into resistance. And now they were doing it one final time. The first Ottoman wave suffered heavy losses. The defenders held. For a brief moment, it may have seemed possible that the walls would survive one more sunrise. But the assault was not finished. It had only begun. After the first wave pulled back, the second attack came. This time with stronger forces, more disciplined, better armed, more determined. Again, the walls shook with violence. Again, the defenders were forced to respond without rest. There was no time to breathe, no time to count the dead. Only movement, only survival. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander who had become one of the most important defenders of the city, was at the center of the resistance near the land walls. His experience mattered. His presence gave confidence to exhausted soldiers. He moved where the fighting was hardest, directing men, reinforcing weak points, keeping order where panic could easily spread. Beside him, Byzantine soldiers and volunteers fought not for victory, but for time, for one more hour, one more gate, one more sunrise. Somewhere along those walls, Emperor Constantine XI was there as well, not watching from safety, fighting, moving between soldiers, sharing the danger. History remembers him not in a palace, but on the walls of his city, in armor, among men who knew they were defending the final hours of Byzantium. Outside, Sultan Mehmed watched the progress of the assault carefully. He did not waste his strongest troops too early. He waited. He measured exhaustion. He watched for weakness. He understood that victory often comes not at the loudest moment, but at the moment when tired hands fail to lift a sword. That moment was approaching. As dawn slowly began to rise, the outlines of the battlefield became clearer. Smoke hung in the air. Broken ladders lay against the walls. Bodies covered the ground below. The defenders were still standing, but they were beyond exhaustion. The walls had held, but the men holding them were running out of strength. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The Janissaries, fresh, disciplined, elite soldiers trained for the final break. They advanced with purpose, not chaos. No wasted movement, no hesitation. This was the strike meant to end everything. The defenders, already exhausted from hours of fighting, faced the strongest force of the morning. And this time, the pressure was different. Some breaches in the walls had widened. Some defensive positions were failing. Every man still standing understood that this was the final test. Some accounts describe the sky beginning to lighten as the Janissaries reached the walls. Morning was arriving, and with it, the final chance to save the city or lose it forever. Then came one of the most important turning points of the battle. Giovanni Giustiniani was badly wounded. The exact details remain debated, but the result was immediate. He was carried away from the walls. For the defenders, the effect was devastating. A commander who had been holding order in chaos was suddenly gone. Morale broke. Panic spread. If even Giustiniani was leaving, many believed the end had already come. The walls were still standing, but belief was beginning to fall. And in battles like this, belief can matter as much as stone. Somewhere near the gate of St. Romanus, pressure increased. Breaches widened. Defenders weakened. The city was reaching the final moment. The last assault was no longer coming. It was already there. By sunrise, the battle for Constantinople had reached its final and most desperate stage. For hours, the defenders had resisted wave after wave of attack. They had pushed back ladders. They had repaired broken sections of wall with earth, wood, and whatever strength remained in their hands. They had fought without rest, without certainty, and almost without hope. But now the balance was changing. The walls were still standing, yet the defense itself was beginning to break. Near the gate of St. Romanus, where the heaviest bombardment had been focused for weeks, the damage was severe. The ancient stones of the Theodosian walls had absorbed more punishment than they had in centuries. Large sections were cracked. Some outer defences had already collapsed. Temporary barriers stood where great walls once had. Men were no longer defending a perfect fortress. They were defending ruins. And ruins are much harder to hold. The Janissaries pressed forward with relentless discipline. They did not attack with wild speed. They advanced with order, step by step, shield by shield. Each movement supported by the men beside them. Behind them, more soldiers waited. The pressure never stopped. For the Byzantine defenders, exhaustion had become the true enemy. Arms grew heavy. Breathing became harder. Fear mixed with fatigue until both felt the same. Some men could no longer hear commands clearly through the noise. Some fought only from instinct. Others looked around and realized they no longer recognized the faces beside them. War, at its final stage, becomes less about strategy and more about endurance. Who can remain standing the longest? Who can still hold a sword when the body wants only to fall? Emperor Constantine XI remained near the fighting. He had refused every chance to escape. Now, with the walls failing around him, he stayed where the battle was strongest. There would be no final speech, no dramatic farewell, only action, only the choice to remain. Some accounts describe him fighting in full armour beside his men, not as a distant emperor, but as another defender of the wall. Whether every detail is exact or not, history remembers the same truth. He did not abandon the city. As the pressure increased, Another critical moment unfolded. A small postern gate, known later in some accounts as the Kerkoporta, may have been left open or poorly defended during the confusion. Historians still debate the details, but somewhere along the defences, Ottoman soldiers found an opening. It did not need to be large. In battles like this, sometimes history enters through a single unlocked door. Once attackers gained a foothold inside, panic spread quickly. Defenders who had spent hours holding the outer line suddenly faced danger from within. The walls were no longer a clear boundary between safety and invasion. The city itself was becoming the battlefield. At the same time, the great Ottoman banners were rising closer to the breaches. Soldiers climbed over broken stone. Commands were shouted in triumph and desperation. Trumpets and battle cries mixed with the sounds of collapsing defences. The Janissaries pushed forward, and for the first time in centuries, the impossible was happening. The walls of Constantinople were being crossed. For the people inside the city, the realization came like a wave. Some heard it through shouting in the streets. Some saw soldiers running. Some understood simply because the sound had changed. There is a moment in every siege when fear becomes certainty. This was that moment. Families who had spent the night waiting now understood there would be no miracle. Some fled toward churches. Some locked doors that could never truly protect them. Some stood frozen, unable to accept that the city they had known all their lives was ending around them. Inside Hagia Sophia, prayers had already turned into desperate refuge. People gathered not because stone walls could save them, but because human beings search for sacred places when the world begins to collapse. Outside, the final resistance near the breaches was breaking apart. Giustiniani was gone. The defenders were scattered. The emperor was still fighting. But numbers, exhaustion, and time had all chosen the same side. The fall was no longer a possibility. It was happening. The great city that had stood for more than 1,000 years was opening to a new empire. The Roman world in the east was ending, and the Ottoman age was beginning. Somewhere above the broken walls, the Ottoman flag rose over the city. For the soldiers below, it was the signal of victory. For the people inside, it was the sign that history had changed forever. The walls had not simply been broken. An era had been broken with them. Once the walls were breached, the battle changed completely. For weeks, the defenders of Constantinople had fought to keep the war outside the city. As long as the walls stood, there was still order, there was still structure, there was still the hope that the city might survive one more day. But once the Ottoman soldiers entered through the broken defences, everything changed. The battle was no longer at the gates. It was now inside the streets. The narrow roads of Constantinople, once filled with merchants, pilgrims, and daily life, became paths of confusion, fear, and desperate movement. People ran in every direction. Some fled toward churches, some toward the harbour, some toward their homes, hoping to find family before it was too late. Others simply stood frozen, unable to understand how quickly centuries of security had disappeared. The sound inside the city was unlike anything before. Shouting, running footsteps, steel against stone, doors closing, prayers, cries for help, church bells ringing in panic. The final collapse of a world does not happen quietly. It arrives all at once. Near the breaches in the walls, the last defenders were still fighting. Emperor Constantine XI remained among them. There would be no surrender, no formal retreat. He had chosen his place long before that morning. If Constantinople was going to fall, he would fall with it. The exact details of his final moments are uncertain. Some accounts say he threw off the imperial symbols of his rank so that he would die as a soldier among soldiers. Some say he was last seen fighting near the gate of St. Romanus. Others describe him disappearing into the chaos of battle, never to be found with certainty. History cannot give us every detail, but it remembers the most important truth. The last Byzantine emperor did not abandon his city. He died where his empire ended, and with him, more than 1,000 years of Roman imperial continuity came to an end. For many inside Constantinople, the centre of hope had become Hagia Sophia. As the city fell, thousands of people gathered there. Men, women, children, priests, nobles, servants, people from every part of the city. Some believed the great church would be protected. Some believed in old prophecies that divine intervention might still save the city. Others simply needed somewhere to go. Inside, beneath the vast dome, prayers became louder. Fear became visible. People clung to one another. Candles still burned, but now their light felt smaller against the growing noise outside. The church that had witnessed centuries of Byzantine glory was now witnessing its final hours as the heart of an empire. Outside, Ottoman soldiers moved deeper into the city. For many, this was victory beyond imagination. They had crossed the impossible walls. They had entered the city that generations had dreamed of taking. The standards of the empire rose higher. Commands spread quickly. Strategic points were secured. Gates were opened from within. More troops entered. The fall accelerated. At the harbour, panic spread as some tried to escape by sea. Ships were crowded, families separated in confusion. Some managed to flee. Many could not. The Golden Horn, which had so often brought trade and life to the city, now watched the final scattering of its people. In the streets, ordinary life disappeared in a matter of hours. The baker who had opened his shop only yesterday, the priest who had spoken prayers in the night, the child who had slept through the first cannon blasts. All of them were now part of history moving faster than human understanding. This is often forgotten in great military victories. We remember emperors and sultans, We remember flags and walls. But cities are made of ordinary people. And when cities fall, it is ordinary people who feel it first. Some hid. Some prayed. Some resisted. Some simply waited for soldiers to knock at the door. The fall of Constantinople was not only the victory of one empire over another, it was the ending of thousands of private worlds at once. By mid-morning, resistance had largely collapsed. The city belonged to Mehmed. After nearly 2 months of siege, after centuries of failed attempts by others, Constantinople had finally fallen. The impossible had happened. The city that had stood against Persians, Arabs, Crusaders, Bulgars, Rus, and countless armies across the centuries had finally opened its gates to a new ruler. For Sultan Mehmed II, this was more than conquest. It was transformation. He was no longer simply a young Ottoman ruler. He was now Fatih, the conqueror, the man who had taken Constantinople, the man who had reshaped history. For Europe, the shock was enormous. For the Orthodox Christian world, it felt like the collapse of a sacred center. For the Ottoman Empire, it marked the beginning of something much larger. Power shifted. Trade routes changed. The political map of the world began to move. Historians would later say that the Middle Ages ended here, on these walls, on this morning, in this city. But for the people standing in those streets, history did not feel like an age ending. It felt like dust in the air, smoke above rooftops, fear behind closed doors, and the strange silence that comes after great violence, when people look around and realize that the world they knew yesterday no longer exists. By the afternoon of May 29, 1453, Constantinople was no longer Byzantine. It was becoming something else, something new, something that would one day be known to the world by another name: Istanbul. By the first full morning after the conquest, the city was no longer the same place. The smoke of battle still lingered in the air. Broken stone covered the streets near the walls. Doors stood open where panic had passed through only hours before. The sound of war had faded, but its presence remained everywhere. Constantinople had fallen. And with that fall, 1,000 years of Byzantine rule had come to an end. But history rarely pauses for mourning. Even while the city was still trying to understand what had happened, a new order was already beginning. Sultan Mehmed II entered the city not simply as a victorious commander, but as a ruler stepping into the center of his future empire. He was only 21 years old, yet on that morning he carried the weight of something much larger than personal triumph. He was walking into history. Accounts describe him entering Constantinople with discipline rather than celebration. There was victory, yes, but also seriousness. He understood the meaning of what had happened. This was not just another city taken in war. This was Constantinople, the city of emperors, the city that had stood between worlds for more than 1,000 years. To conquer it was to inherit its memory. As he moved through the streets, he passed ruins, silence, and people watching from behind half-open doors. Some looked with fear, some with disbelief, some simply with exhaustion. For them, the question was no longer whether the city had fallen. It was what would happen next. One of Mehmed's most remembered destinations that day was Hagia Sophia. Only hours earlier, it had been filled with final prayers. Now its great doors opened to a different future. He entered the building that had stood for centuries as the spiritual heart of Byzantium. The vast dome still rose above him. The marble floors still carried the footsteps of emperors. The silence inside was heavy. Some accounts say Mehmed paused there for a long moment, not out of hesitation, but recognition. He understood symbolism, and there were few places in the world more symbolic than this. Soon, Hagia Sophia would become a mosque, not as an act of destruction alone, but as a declaration that the city itself had entered a new age. The center of one empire had become the center of another. Outside, life was beginning again, though not in the same form. Markets would reopen, homes would be repaired, new laws would be established, new officials would arrive, and slowly the city would begin learning how to live under a different ruler. This is something history books often move past too quickly. The day after conquest, the ordinary work of survival. Because after empires fall, people still need bread. Children still wake up hungry. Water still must be carried. Streets still must be cleaned. Even the end of an age must make room for mourning. Mehmed knew that an empty city was not a victory. He wanted Constantinople alive. He encouraged repopulation. He brought administrators, merchants, scholars, craftsmen and families into the city. He wanted not only conquest, but renewal. He was not simply taking the old capital. He was building a new one. In time, Constantinople would grow again. Its identity would change. Its language would change. Its rulers, its rhythms, its skyline. But its importance would remain. It would continue to stand where continents meet, where trade moves, where empires dream of permanence. And eventually, the world would know it by another name: Istanbul. For Emperor Constantine XI, there would be no tomb large enough for what he represented. His body was never clearly identified. In many ways, that feels fitting. He became part of the city itself, not remembered through a palace, but through the walls where he made his final stand. For the people who survived, memory would remain longer than stone. They would remember the candles in Hagia Sophia, the silence before dawn, the sound of the final assault, the moment the walls were crossed, and the strange stillness of the first morning after everything had changed. For Mehmed, history would remember him forever as Fatih Sultan Mehmed, the conqueror. Not because he won a battle, but because he changed the shape of the world. The fall of Constantinople was not simply the end of Byzantium. It was the closing of the Roman Middle Ages. It was the rise of Ottoman Istanbul. It was the movement of power from one age into another. Some historians say the Middle Ages ended here. Others say history never changes in a single morning. Perhaps both are true. Because while empires rise and fall in books, for ordinary people, history changes quietly, in the sound of unfamiliar footsteps outside the door, in a new flag above the walls, in the first sunrise over a city with a different future. And so, as the sun rose over the Bosphorus on that morning in 1453, the city still stood. The same stones, the same sea, the same sky, and yet everything was different. Constantinople was gone. Istanbul had begun. And somewhere in that quiet morning light, one age ended and another began. The city that had once been the heart of the Byzantine Empire would not disappear. It would change. Its churches, its markets, its ports, and its streets would continue to breathe beneath new rulers and under a new name. For Sultan Mehmed II, victory was never only about conquest. He did not want a ruined city. He wanted a living capital, a centre of trade, a centre of power, a city that would stand at the heart of a growing empire. And so, almost immediately, the work of rebuilding began. Homes were repaired, markets reopened, officials were appointed, families were brought into the city. Merchants, scholars, craftsmen and workers from across the empire were encouraged to settle there. Mehmed understood something many conquerors did not. A city is not won by taking its walls. A city is won by giving it a future. Hagia Sophia, once the great cathedral of Byzantium, became one of the first symbols of this transformation. Its silence changed, its purpose changed, but its importance remained. It still stood at the centre of the city, watching history continue, just as it always had. And slowly, Constantinople became Istanbul. Not in a single day, not with one single decision, but through years of new life growing over old memory. The streets changed, the language changed, the rulers changed, but the city remained what it had always been, a bridge between worlds. For Europe, the fall of Constantinople was a shock that echoed for generations. For the Ottoman Empire, it was the beginning of its greatest age. And for the people who lived there, it was something simpler and more human. It was waking up the next morning and realizing life must continue. Bread still had to be baked. Water still had to be carried. Children still needed food. Even after empires fall, ordinary life returns first. That may be the quietest truth in all of history. We remember battles. We remember kings. We remember the day the walls were broken. But people remember smaller things. The last candle lit in a family home. The final prayer inside Hagia Sophia. The sound of distant cannons before sunrise. the silence after it was all over. And perhaps that is what makes history feel real. Not the conquest itself, but the lives lived inside it. Constantine XI would be remembered as the last Byzantine emperor, the ruler who chose to stay. Mehmed II would be remembered as Fatih Sultan Mehmed, the conqueror who changed the world. And the city itself would be remembered by both names: Constantinople, Istanbul. Two names, one city, one endless story. Because cities like this are never truly conquered. They are inherited. They carry every empire that passes through them, every prayer, every battle, every sunrise. And so, as the Bosporus continued to reflect the morning light, the world moved forward. The Middle Ages faded. A new age began. And somewhere between the old walls and the open sea, history quietly turned its page.